This baby had minutes to live when Western doctors walked away. What the indigenous woman did next, using only plants and ancient knowledge, saved a life that $50,000 worth of medical equipment couldn't. But here's the part that'll shock you most. The American frontier wasn't exactly a place where you could dial 911 and expect an ambulance. If you got sick in a small western town during the 1800s, your options were pretty limited. And by limited, I mean you might be lucky to find one doctor within 100 miles. Most frontier settlements had populations smaller than your average high school, yet somehow people survived broken bones, fevers, and childbirth without modern hospitals. How? They got creative with what they had. Settlers brought their grandmother's remedies from back east. They brew teas from whatever plants they could find. Willow bark for pain, wild mint for stomach troubles. Some folks swore by whiskey for just about everything. Though that might have been wishful thinking more than actual medicine, the thing is, these weren't just random guesses. Many herbal treatments actually worked. Native American tribes had been using these same plants for centuries before the first wagon train rolled through. They knew which roots could stop bleeding, which leaves could break a fever, and which berries were deadly poison. But here's where it gets complicated. While white settlers were experimenting with folk remedies they barely understood, native healers had spent generations perfecting their craft. Medicine men and women studied under tribal elders for years. They learned not just what plants to use, but when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and which ceremonies accompanied the healing process. The knowledge gap was enormous. A settler might know that chewing willow bark helped with headaches. A native healer understood that the same bark, prepared differently, could reduce dangerous fevers in children. One approach was guesswork. The other was science passed down through oral tradition. Then there's the superstition factor. Frontier life was unpredictable and often brutal. When rational explanations fell short, people turned to supernatural ones. Some believed illness came from bad air or divine punishment. Others thought certain people carried curses. A few folks were convinced that wearing specific charms could ward off disease. These beliefs weren't always harmless. Sometimes they prevented people from seeking actual help. A mother might refuse to let her feverish child drink water because someone told her it would make the sickness worse. Or a family might avoid a particular healer because they belong to the wrong group. Well, that brings us to the real problem. Fear of mixing healing traditions often overruled common sense. White settlers who desperately needed medical help would sometimes refuse treatment from native healers, even when those healers had the exact knowledge that could save lives. This wasn't just about medical knowledge, it was about control, territory, and deep-seated prejudices that ran through frontier society like fault lines. Some settlers viewed native healing practices as witchcraft or devil worship. They'd rather risk death than accept help from someone they'd been taught to fear. The irony is thick here. These same settlers were living on land that native tribes had called home for thousands of years. They were eating plants that native people had cultivated. They were surviving in climates that would have killed them without indigenous knowledge about water sources, weather patterns, and natural resources. But when it came to medicine, literally life and death situations, pride and prejudice often won out over survival instincts. Let's not forget that this fear went both directions. Native communities had every reason to be suspicious of white settlers. They'd seen their people killed by diseases brought from Europe. They'd watched their sacred land seized and their children forced into schools that tried to erase their culture. Trust wasn't exactly flowing freely between these groups, and in the medical world, trust matters. A healer needs to understand not just symptoms, but the person suffering from them. Language barriers made communication difficult. Cultural differences made interpretation nearly impossible. Yet despite all these obstacles, healing sometimes happened anyway. Desperate situations have a way of breaking down artificial barriers. When a child was dying and the town doctor was nowhere to be found, parents would turn to whoever might help. These moments created cracks in the wall of separation. A settler woman might learn that native remedies actually worked. A tribal healer might discover that some European techniques had value. Slowly, quietly, knowledge began to cross cultural lines. The frontier was harsh, but it was also a place where survival mattered more than social rules. People who would never speak to each other under normal circumstances found themselves thrown together by geography, weather, and shared struggles. But what happened when those struggles involved the most vulnerable members of society? When prejudice met desperation in the form of a sick child, which force would prove stronger? Lightning split the summer sky like nature's own scalpel, and that's when little Emma's fever spiked. One minute she was playing with cornhusk dolls on the cabin floor. The next, she was burning up like a tiny furnace in her mother's arms. Sarah pressed her palm against her daughter's forehead and felt her heart drop. The child's skin was hot enough to fry bacon. Well, maybe not literally, but close enough to terrify any frontier mother who'd already buried too many neighbors' babies. Thunder crashed overhead as if the heavens themselves were announcing trouble. Sarah rocked Emma gently, whispering prayers and trying not to panic. But panic was exactly what frontier mothers did best when their children fell sick. They had good reason. Out here on the prairie, children dropped like flies during disease outbreaks. Measles could wipe out half the kids in a settlement before anyone knew what hit them. Cholera was even worse. It killed so fast that families barely had time to dig graves. And the weird part is, nobody really understood why some children lived while others didn't. The statistics were brutal, though most settlers couldn't read them anyway. In some frontier towns, 4 out of every 10 children never made it to their 5th birthday. Makes sense why mothers aged so fast out here, right? Every cough, every fever, every unusual cry sent them into protective overdrive. Sarah wrapped Emma in a worn quilt and stepped onto the porch. Rain pelted the wooden planks like angry bullets. She needed help, and she needed it fast. But where could she turn? Then there was the neighbor problem. Mrs. Henderson next door had lost 3 babies to fever. Her advice usually involved whiskey and prayer, not necessarily in that order. Old Pete across the way swore by onion poultices for everything from snake bites to broken hearts. Useful? Maybe. Reliable? That was another story entirely. But desperate mothers didn't have the luxury of being picky. They grabbed whatever wisdom they could find, even if it came from the town drunk or the preacher's wife who talked to her dead cats. Sarah had seen women try everything from mustard plasters to hanging garlic around their babies' necks. The strange thing about frontier communities was how fast bad news traveled. Good news? That took forever. But let one child fall seriously ill, and suddenly every woman within 5 miles knew about it before the next sunrise. They'd arrive with remedies, stories, and enough conflicting advice to confuse a Philadelphia doctor. Emma's breathing grew shallow and rapid. Her tiny chest rose and fell like a broken bellows. Sarah felt that familiar ice-cold fear creeping up her spine, the same fear that had claimed her neighbor's boy just last winter. Disease didn't discriminate on the frontier. Rich or poor, settler or native-born, children faced the same brutal odds. Diphtheria could strangle a banker's daughter just as easily as a farmer's son. Scarlet fever turned rosy-cheeked toddlers into tiny ghosts within days. Well, some diseases did play favorites. Smallpox had devastated native communities for generations before white settlers arrived. Measles followed the same cruel pattern. But when new sicknesses emerged, everyone's children became equally vulnerable. Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. The closest thing to a real doctor was Dr. Morrison in town, assuming he was sober and willing to make the ride in this storm. That was a big assumption. Frontier doctors weren't exactly known for their reliability or bedside manner. Most of them had learned medicine through apprenticeships or mail-order courses. Some were genuinely skilled healers who'd trained back east. Others were glorified barbers who'd decided doctoring paid better than cutting hair. The problem was figuring out which type you were dealing with before it was too late. Then there were the traveling medicine men with their miracle cures and fancy bottles. They'd roll into town promising to heal everything from consumption to heartbreak. By the time folks realized the medicine was mostly alcohol and sugar water, these snake oil salesmen had vanished like smoke. Emma whimpered softly, bringing Sarah's attention back to the moment. The storm was getting worse, and so was her daughter's condition. Every minute counted now. The irony wasn't lost on frontier mothers. They lived in an age of supposed progress, yet they faced the same helplessness as mothers throughout history. All the westward expansion and manifest destiny talk didn't mean much when your child was dying in your arms. Sarah made her decision. She'd bundle Emma up and head for town, storm or no storm. Dr. Morrison might be her only real chance, despite his reputation for drinking and his questionable medical credentials. But what she didn't know yet was that having a doctor nearby didn't guarantee help would come. Sometimes the biggest obstacles weren't distance or weather. They were the prejudices that lived in people's hearts. When folks in frontier towns got sick, they usually had one option for professional medical help: the town doctor. These weren't exactly the cream of the medical crop, mind you. Most frontier doctors had maybe a year or two of formal training, if they were lucky. Some just showed up with a black bag and called themselves doctors. Nobody was checking credentials out there, but here's where things get ugly. Even these barely qualified doctors could pick and choose their patients, and many of them did exactly that based on the color of someone's skin. Dr. Harrison McBride had been treating folks in Cedar Falls for 3 years. He'd set bones, delivered babies, and pulled more teeth than he cared to count. The man knew his way around basic frontier medicine. What he also knew was how to turn people away when they didn't look like his idea of proper patients. Native families, mixed heritage children? Well, that was a different story entirely. The racial prejudice wasn't just some quiet, hidden thing either. It was right out in the open, bold as brass. Professional men in the 1800s, West didn't even try to hide their discrimination. They wore it like a badge of honor. Doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, they all had their own ideas about who deserved their services and who didn't. Then there's the practical side of frontier medicine that made everything worse. These doctors were working with almost nothing. Their medical supplies could fit in a couple of saddlebags, maybe some laudanum for pain, a bone saw, some basic bandages, and whatever herbs they could scrounge up locally. That's about it. No antibiotics, no proper surgical tools, certainly no fancy equipment. Makes sense that they'd want to conserve their limited resources for the right kind of patients, right? Wrong, but that's how they justified it. Payment was another messy situation entirely. Nobody had much cash money on the frontier. Doctors got paid in chickens, grain, maybe a side of beef if they were lucky. Sometimes they'd get a promise of payment come harvest time. Other times, they'd work for free and hope the community remembered their kindness later. But when it came to native families, even this barter system got complicated. Some doctors figured these folks wouldn't pay up anyway. Others worried about what their regular patients might think if word got around that they were treating Indians and mixed heritage children. Community pressure played a huge role in medical decisions back then. The doctor's reputation depended entirely on keeping the right people happy. Cross the wrong influential families, and suddenly your practice could dry up faster than a creek in August. These towns were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Dr. McBride had felt this pressure before. Last winter, he'd hesitated about treating a native woman's broken arm. The hesitation lasted just long enough for gangrene to set in. She lost the arm entirely. Word spread through both communities about what happened. The native families remembered. So did the white settlers, though they remembered it differently. What's really twisted is how limited medical training actually made some doctors more stubborn about their methods. They knew so little that they couldn't afford to admit uncertainty about anything. Acknowledging that native healers might know something useful, that would mean admitting their own education was incomplete. And the weird part is, many of these same doctors had witnessed native healing methods work. They'd seen fevers break with herbal remedies they couldn't identify. They'd watched infections clear up using plant medicines their medical schools never mentioned. But professional pride kept them from learning or collaborating. Some frontier doctors were different, of course. A few treated anyone who showed up at their door, regardless of background. These doctors often learned valuable techniques from native healers and incorporated them into their practice, but they were the exception, not the rule. The medical profession in the 1800s was already struggling to establish credibility and authority. Doctors were competing with folk healers, traveling medicine shows, and native healing traditions that had centuries of proven results. Instead of learning from these other approaches, many chose to dismiss them entirely. Well, that strategy backfired more often than it succeeded, especially when desperate families had nowhere else to turn. Dr. McBride kept detailed records of his patients and treatments. Funny thing about those records, they show a pattern of refusing care to certain families during their most desperate hours. The same families who would later find healing elsewhere, using methods he dismissed as primitive superstition. The irony cuts deep when you realize these primitive methods often work better than what the doctor could offer. But admitting that would require swallowing a pride bigger than the territory itself. When the next desperate mother arrived at his door, Dr. McBride would face a choice that revealed everything about frontier medicine's ugly contradictions. The baby's breathing grew shallower by the hour. Every wheeze cut through the mother's heart like a knife. She'd tried everything she could think of: cool cloths, warm broths, even old songs her grandmother had taught her. Nothing worked. The fever burned on, relentless as a prairie fire. Her neighbors had stopped visiting. Word travels fast in small towns, and when a mixed heritage child falls sick, people start making excuses. Too busy with harvest, they'd say. Don't want to catch whatever it is. But she knew the real reason. Fear mixed with prejudice creates a powerful poison. The town doctor lived just 3 blocks away. She could see his house from her window, a neat white building with glass windows and a painted sign. Dr. Harrison had delivered half the babies in town. Surely he wouldn't turn away a dying child. She wrapped her son in the cleanest blanket she owned and stepped into the dusty street. The walk felt like miles. Each step echoed with desperation. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the wooden steps to his office. Dr. Harrison was washing his hands when she entered, a tall man with graying whiskers and tired eyes. He'd seen plenty of sick children, saved plenty of lives. She placed her baby on his examination table without invitation. "Please," she whispered, "he's burning up. 3 days now." The doctor glanced at the child, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression. His hands stopped moving. "I can't help you," he said quietly, "but he's just a baby. Find your own people." The words came out flat, final. "There's nothing I can do here." She stared at him. "Your own people," as if suffering had different colors, as if fever checked bloodlines before it struck. The baby made a small sound, barely audible, and she gathered him closer. "I can pay," she said, though they both knew she had little money. "I have chickens, vegetables from my garden." Dr. Harrison turned back to his wash basin. "I said no." The rejection hit her like a physical blow. Here was a man who'd taken an oath to heal, who'd studied medicine, learned about bodies and bones and blood, yet he saw something else when he looked at her child, something that made healing impossible. Women in the 1800s West learned early that their voices carried about as much weight as tumbleweeds. They could plead, cry, or rage. Men would listen politely, then do exactly what they'd planned all along. The frontier was built on the backs of strong women, but decision-making, that belonged to the men. She stood there for a long moment, holding her dying son. The doctor's office smelled of carbolic acid and leather. Medical books lined the shelves. Bottles of mysterious medicines caught the afternoon light. Everything needed to save a life, right within reach. Might as well have been on the moon. "Please," she tried once more. "Look at him. Really look." But Dr. Harrison had already made up his mind. Community pressure was a powerful force in frontier towns. Treat the wrong patient, and suddenly your other patients might find different doctors. Your reputation could crumble faster than adobe in a rainstorm. Business was business, even when business involved babies. The door closed behind her with a soft click, final as a coffin lid. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, her child growing weaker in her arms. The nearest hospital sat 3 days away by wagon. If the weather held, if the wheels didn't break, if the baby could survive the journey. Big assumptions when time was running out. Other mothers in town would have options. They'd have relatives, friends, connections. They'd have doctors who saw patients instead of skin color. They'd have communities that rallied around sick children instead of whispering behind curtains. But she had something else. Something the good doctor had mentioned without meaning to help. Her own people. The ones who'd been healing on this land long before the first medical school opened back east. Long before the first white coat was ever worn. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she walked home. Her son's fever matched the day's heat. Each step was a choice between hope and despair. Behind her, Dr. Harrison's office stood clean and proud. Ahead lay a different kind of medicine entirely. Traditional healing methods had kept people alive for thousands of years. Maybe it was time to remember what the frontier towns had tried so hard to forget. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, a small sign, but enough to keep her moving. She had one more option left, one that would require setting aside everything she'd been taught about proper medicine. The question was whether pride mattered more than her child's life. The rejection stung worse than the summer heat. But when your child is burning with fever and the town doctor slams his door in your face, desperation has a funny way of opening your mind to possibilities you might have ignored before. Native healers didn't advertise their services in the local newspaper. They didn't hang wooden signs outside their homes or charge standard fees like the frontier doctors did. Word of mouth was everything in their world. You had to know someone who knew someone, and even then, approaching a medicine man or woman required respect and humility that many white settlers found difficult to swallow. The mother had heard whispers about an old Lakota healer who lived near the creek, about 2 miles from town. Some folks called him Joseph, though that probably wasn't his real name. Most Native people in the area had been given Christian names by missionaries or government officials, but their true names carried meanings that went deeper than any census record could capture. What made this situation even more interesting? Native healers often treated anyone who came to them genuinely seeking help. While the town doctor let prejudice guide his medical decisions, traditional healers operated under entirely different principles. Their calling wasn't about money or social status. It was about balance, harmony, and the sacred duty to heal when the spirits called them to do so. The walk to Joseph's dwelling felt longer than 2 miles. Every step carried the weight of crossing invisible boundaries that had been drawn by years of mistrust and misunderstanding. The baby's breathing had grown more labored, and time was running out fast. When she finally reached the small cabin by the creek, the mother found Joseph tending to a garden of plants she didn't recognize. He looked up without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her arrival. Makes sense, right? In small frontier communities, news traveled faster than wildfire, and he'd probably heard about the sick child and the doctor's refusal hours ago. Traditional healing operated on principles that would seem foreign to most frontier settlers. While doctors focused on specific symptoms and tried to fight disease directly, Native healers looked at illness as a sign that something larger was out of balance. They didn't just treat the fever, they treated the whole person, the family, and sometimes even the community's relationship with the natural world. Joseph examined the baby with gentle hands and knowing eyes. His diagnosis didn't come from medical textbooks or university training. Instead, it came from decades of learning passed down through generations of healers, each one carefully chosen and trained by their elders. This wasn't guesswork or superstition, despite what many white settlers believed. It was a sophisticated medical system that had kept Native communities healthy for thousands of years. Then there's the matter of herbal medicine, which frontier doctors often dismissed as primitive nonsense. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Many of the plant remedies used by Native healers contained the same active compounds that modern pharmaceuticals would later isolate and synthesize. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid. Sound familiar? That's essentially aspirin, discovered by modern medicine decades later. Joseph prepared a tea from willow bark and other herbs, explaining each step to the worried mother. His English was careful but clear, mixed with words from his own language that seemed to carry meanings English couldn't quite capture. The preparation wasn't rushed or clinical like a doctor's visit might be. Every action had purpose and ceremony behind it, but the healing process involved more than just herbal remedies. Joseph began a quiet chant while preparing the medicine, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to echo the rhythm of the creek outside. Smoke from burning sage filled the small room, and he moved his hands over the baby in gestures that looked like blessings. This combination of practical medicine and spiritual ceremony often confused white observers. They wanted to separate the real medicine from what they saw as religious ritual. Yet for Native healers, the two couldn't be separated. Healing the body without addressing the spiritual imbalance would be like trying to fix a broken wagon wheel while ignoring the damaged axle. The baby's fever began to break as the night wore on. Joseph stayed close, monitoring the child's condition and adjusting his treatment as needed. No rushing off to other patients or sending bills for services rendered. This was healing as it had been practiced for generations, with patience, attention, and a deep understanding that recovery couldn't be hurried. As dawn approached and the child's breathing finally steadied, something had shifted in that small cabin by the creek. But what would this mean for a frontier community built on rigid boundaries between us and them? The frontier doctor had turned his back, but the native healer, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. While that doctor was probably sleeping peacefully in his comfortable bed, This medicine man sat cross-legged beside a dying child through the entire night. No payment discussed, no conditions set, just a sick baby who needed help, and an elder who knew what to do about it. The first thing he did might surprise you. He didn't reach for some mysterious potion or start chanting immediately. Instead, he carefully examined the child's breathing, felt the burning forehead, and listened to the rapid heartbeat. This wasn't magic, it was diagnosis. Native healers had been reading symptoms and understanding illness for thousands of years before the first medical school opened its doors. Then came the willow bark. The mother watched as he peeled thin strips from branches he'd brought in his leather pouch. He crushed the bark between two stones, mixing it with water from the family's well. What she didn't know was that she was witnessing the use of nature's original aspirin. That willow bark contained salicin, the same compound that would later become the foundation for modern aspirin tablets. The frontier doctor had nothing in his black bag more effective for bringing down a dangerous fever. But here's where it gets interesting. While the herbal medicine worked on the child's body, the healer began addressing what he saw as the spiritual side of the illness. He lit sage and sweetgrass, letting the smoke drift over the baby. To the mother, raised in a world of church pews and hymns, this seemed foreign. Yet something about the ritual felt deeply familiar. Wasn't her own faith built on the power of prayer and ceremony? The song started low and rhythmic. Not loud enough to wake neighbors, but constant enough to fill the small cabin with something that felt like hope. The healer explained in his broken English mixed with hand gestures that illness sometimes came when the spirit felt lost or frightened. The songs were meant to call it back home to the body. Hours crawled by. The mother dozed fitfully in her chair while the medicine man maintained his vigil. Every so often, he'd place his weathered hand on the child's chest, checking the breathing. When the fever spiked again near midnight, he prepared another dose of willow bark tea, this time adding what looked like dried berries. Well, those berries weren't random either. They were elderberries, packed with immune-boosting compounds that modern science now recognizes as genuinely therapeutic. This wasn't superstition or primitive guesswork. This was sophisticated medicine practiced by people who'd spent generations observing what worked and what didn't. The weird part is how much the healer seemed to understand about the child's mixed heritage. He spoke quietly to the baby in his own language, then switched to English, then hummed melodies that sounded almost like the lullabies the mother remembered from her own childhood. It was as if he recognized that this little one belonged to multiple worlds and needed healing that honored all of them. Around 3 a.m, something shifted. The baby's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow and deepen. The burning fever that had terrified the mother started to break, leaving the child's skin damp but cooler. The medicine man nodded but didn't celebrate yet. He'd seen too many children take turns for the worse just when hope seemed justified. Then there was the matter of payment. When dawn light started filtering through the cabin's single window, the mother tried to offer the healer what little money she had. He waved it away, pointing instead to a small pot of honey on her shelf. Fair trade, he seemed to say. Honey for healing. Makes sense, right? Honey never spoils, and it had its own medicinal properties he could use for future patients. The child's eyes opened as the sun came up, still weak, still sick, but undeniably alive. The crisis had passed. What no frontier doctor would attempt, what the professional medical man had refused to even try, had been accomplished by someone the town considered a savage. But don't think this was just about superior plant knowledge or better bedside manner. The healer had given something the doctor couldn't or wouldn't provide. He'd treated the child as fully human, deserving of care regardless of bloodline or social standing. In a world where your ancestry determined your access to help, that was revolutionary medicine. Indeed. The mother would never forget watching two healing traditions merge in her small cabin that night. She'd witnessed something older than any frontier settlement, yet somehow perfectly suited for the challenges of this new world. Recovery would take days, but the foundation was solid. And word was already starting to spread through town about what had happened when conventional medicine failed. Word traveled fast in frontier towns, faster than a prairie fire and twice as unpredictable. By morning, half the settlement knew about the native healer who'd spent the night at the cabin on the edge of town. The other half? Well, they were about to find out. Mrs. Henderson heard it first at the general store. "That Indian medicine man saved the baby," whispered Sarah Collins, clutching her flour sack like it held state secrets. "Used nothing but plants and singing. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared under her bonnet. She'd been in these parts long enough to know that news like this didn't just spread, it exploded. The whispers grew louder by the hour. Some folks gathered in tight circles, voices hushed but eyes wide with curiosity. Others shook their heads and muttered about dangerous nonsense and ungodly practices. Makes sense, right? Fear of the unknown ran deep in frontier communities, especially when it challenged everything they thought they knew about medicine and healing. But here's where things got interesting. Dr. Morrison, the same man who'd turned away a dying child just days before, found himself in an uncomfortable position. The baby was alive, breathing easy, playing with wooden blocks like nothing had happened. And everyone knew he'd refused to help. Then there was the growing crowd of curious settlers who started asking uncomfortable questions. If that healer could save a baby with fever, what else could he do? Wondered Tom Fletcher, whose rheumatism had been acting up something fierce. His wife Martha shot him a warning look, but the seed was planted. When your bones ache every morning and the town doctor's remedies aren't working, you start considering alternatives. The weird part is how quickly the community split into camps. On one side stood the traditionalists, folks who believed frontier medicine meant pills, powders, and prayers in English only. They viewed the healing as dangerous superstition at best, devil's work at worst. Reverend Walsh held emergency prayer meetings to cleanse the community of heathen influences. Attendance was, well, let's just say it wasn't standing room only. On the other side, a growing number of settlers began questioning why they'd never considered native healing before. Mrs. Patterson, whose youngest had survived scarlet fever thanks to willow bark tea, something she'd learned from watching the healer work, became an unlikely advocate. "Results speak louder than prejudice," she declared at the weekly town meeting. The room went dead silent. Well, the doctor himself faced the biggest crisis of all. Dr. Morrison had trained in Philadelphia, studied under respected physicians, and prided himself on scientific medicine. But science hadn't saved that baby. A native healer with plant knowledge and ancient rituals had accomplished what his medical bag couldn't. The realization gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. Late at night, Morrison found himself reading his medical journals with new eyes. Digitalis from foxglove plants for heart conditions, quinine from cinchona bark for malaria, aspirin derived from willow bark, the same willow bark he'd witnessed the healer use. The boundaries between primitive and advanced medicine started blurring in ways that made his head spin. Community dynamics shifted in unexpected ways. The general store began stocking different herbs after several requests from townsfolk. Old-timers who'd lived alongside native tribes for decades started sharing stories they'd kept quiet for years. Stories about broken bones set with plant poultices, infections cleared with root teas, and fevers broken with ceremonies they'd never understood but couldn't deny. Yet the tension remained thick as summer humidity. Some families stopped speaking to neighbors who'd expressed interest in native healing methods. Church attendance became a silent battleground where seating arrangements revealed allegiances. The town split wasn't just about medicine, it was about identity, tradition, and what it meant to be a civilized frontier community. But why did this one healing create such upheaval? Simple. It challenged the fundamental assumption that Western medicine was superior to all other healing traditions. When a community's core beliefs get shaken, people don't just change their minds. They choose sides. The mother at the center of it all watched these developments with mixed feelings. Her baby was healthy, laughing, growing stronger each day. That's what mattered most. But she'd also inadvertently sparked something bigger than one night of desperate healing. The community was wrestling with questions that went far beyond medicine. Some settlers began approaching her quietly, asking about the healer's methods. Others crossed the street to avoid her entirely. She'd become a symbol of change in a place where change usually came slowly, if at all. The ripple effects continued spreading outward, touching every family in ways both subtle and profound. Because sometimes witnessing something extraordinary forces people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the world around them. And that questioning, it was just the beginning of something much larger taking shape in their small frontier community. What happened next changed frontier medicine forever, though it took decades for anyone to admit it. The child who nearly died that stormy night grew up strong and healthy. More importantly, Word spread about what the native healer had accomplished when the town doctor had walked away. At first, the whisper stayed quiet. Settlers didn't want to seem ungrateful for civilized medicine, but when your neighbor's kid is alive because of willow bark tea while the doctor's expensive pills failed the family down the road, well, people start asking uncomfortable questions. The town doctor found himself in an odd position. He'd spent years dismissing native healing as superstition and mumbo-jumbo. Now he was watching patients recover using methods he'd never learned in medical school. The cognitive dissonance must have been brutal. Here's a man who'd built his entire professional identity on being the educated expert, suddenly realizing he might have been wrong about a few things. Then there's the practical side that nobody talks about much. Frontier doctors were often working with limited supplies and outdated knowledge. Medical schools back east weren't exactly cutting-edge research institutions. Meanwhile, native healers had been perfecting their craft for generations, using plants and techniques that actually worked. They knew which bark reduced fever, which roots fought infection, and which ceremonies helped patients feel hopeful during recovery. Makes sense that some doctors would swallow their pride and start paying attention, right? The really fascinating part is how slowly change happened. We're talking about the 1800s, when racial prejudice was baked into every social institution. Yet medical emergencies have a way of breaking down barriers that seemed impossible to cross. When someone's dying, ideology takes a back seat to results. Some frontier clinics began quietly consulting with native healers. Not officially, mind you, the paperwork never mentioned it. But doctors started asking questions about herbal remedies and treatment methods. They watched how native healers approached patient care, noting the emphasis on treating the whole person rather than just symptoms. And the weird part is, it worked both ways. Native healers sometimes adopted useful techniques from Western medicine. Steel surgical tools were sharper than traditional implements. Certain imported medicines proved effective when combined with traditional treatments. The best healers from both traditions were pragmatic enough to use whatever helped their patients recover. Let's not forget the patients themselves drove much of this change. Frontier families didn't have the luxury of being picky about medical help. If your child was sick and the doctor couldn't help, you'd try anything that might work. Parents who'd witnessed successful native healing became advocates, sharing stories and encouraging others to be more open-minded. The mother from our story became something of a bridge between worlds. She'd experienced both the rejection of Western medicine and the acceptance of native healing. When other families faced similar crises, they sought her advice. She connected desperate parents with healers who could help, regardless of their background or training. This gradual blending created something entirely new in frontier healthcare. Some settlements developed informal networks where doctors and native healers worked together during medical emergencies. It wasn't systematic or widespread, but it happened more often than history books typically acknowledge. Fast forward to today, and you'll find hospitals across America formally incorporating traditional healing practices into patient care. Native American healers work alongside doctors in some medical centers. Patients can receive both conventional treatment and traditional ceremonies. The integration that seemed impossible on the frontier has become mainstream healthcare policy in many places. But why did it take so long? Partly because medical institutions are naturally conservative. They resist change, especially when it challenges established hierarchies and assumptions. Also, the political and social climate needed to shift before alternative healing methods could gain legitimacy. The child who recovered that night became a living symbol of what was possible when healing traditions worked together instead of against each other. Growing up healthy and strong, this kid represented hope for cooperation in a world often divided by fear and prejudice. Of course, not every story had such a happy ending. Many children died when pride or prejudice prevented families from accessing the help they needed. The barriers between different healing traditions cost lives that could have been saved through cooperation and mutual respect. What's remarkable is how individual acts of courage and desperation gradually transformed entire communities. One sick child, one desperate mother, one compassionate healer. These personal moments accumulated into broader social change. The frontier taught harsh lessons about survival and pragmatism. When your life depends on results rather than theory, you become more willing to challenge assumptions and try new approaches. This practical wisdom eventually influenced how we think about healthcare today. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it planted seeds that would grow into modern integrative medicine. And it all started with moments like these, when human compassion overcame cultural barriers to save a life. But the real question becomes, what other medical breakthroughs are we missing because we're too stubborn to look beyond our own traditions?